The road was already narrow when I turned off the main highway, but as I drove deeper into the forest, it seemed to shrink even further, swallowed by the thickening trees. The gravel crunched under my tires, echoing through the dense, almost claustrophobic surroundings. Sunlight fought to pierce the canopy, but shadows were winning the battle, stretching their fingers across the road, growing bolder with every mile. As the minutes ticked by, I felt the last strands of civilization slipping away. Cell service had died miles ago, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the persistent chirping of unseen insects. I adjusted the rearview mirror, expecting nothing but relieved by the illusion of company. I was alone here, the forest seemed to say, and I'd better get used to it. When I finally spotted the cabin, tucked behind a bend in the road like it had been trying to hide from me, my pulse quickened. It looked ancient, its weathered wood faded to a dull gray, as though all the life had been leached from it long ago. The windows were small, dark squares, curtained with grime, and the roof sagged in places, giving it a crooked, tired look. Ivy had claimed the front porch, climbing up the walls and curling around the railing like skeletal fingers holding the place together. I stepped out of the car, the silence thickening around me like a blanket. There was no birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a stillness that felt unnatural. The air was heavy, and as I breathed it in, I caught a strange, earthy smell, something a bit too close to rot. My foot crunched on something as I walked toward the cabin, and I looked down to find a scattering of charred logs and blackened rocks, the remains of a campfire. Recently abandoned, I guessed. But why hadn't anyone told me about other campers? As I scanned the area, other peculiar signs began to jump out. Alongside the path leading to the cabin, I spotted jagged claw marks on the trunks of several trees. They were deep, freshly carved, almost as though something had raked the bark in frustration. Nearby, patches of grass lay in unnatural, dead spots, as though scorched by something. The dry, lifeless earth contrasted starkly with the lush greenery around it, and the sight left an uneasy feeling in my stomach. Inside, the cabin was as foreboding as it had appeared from the outside. The main room was small, with walls made of rough wood that gave off a damp, earthy smell. Dust floated in the beams of dim light that struggled through the windows, casting eerie patterns on the bare floors. A few pieces of mismatched furniture huddled together, an ancient armchair with the stuffing poking out, a rickety table, and a single bed against the wall, its blanket as gray as the cabin's exterior. I dropped my bags onto the floor and exhaled, though the sense of relief was fleeting. The unease was still there, lingering. I went through the motions of unpacking, trying to ignore the sense that I was being watched. Each creak of the floorboards felt louder, sharper, in the oppressive quiet. Night settled faster than I'd expected. Darkness seeped into every corner, wrapping itself around the trees and swallowing what little light remained. I turned on the single lamp beside the bed, its dull yellow glow casting long, sinister shadows. As I settled in, I heard it, the faintest rustling from outside, like leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. Only there was no wind, I realized. Everything was still, frozen as if listening. The sounds didn't stop. A low, scraping noise that seemed to circle the cabin, accompanied by soft, almost imperceptible thuds. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons, or maybe a deer wandering too close. But that rational thought dissolved when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, a shape shifting in the shadows beyond the window. My heart raced, pounding loud enough to drown out any other sound. I sat up, straining to see into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Not that I could see, anyway. The shadows seemed to thicken, pressing closer. I tried to shake off the creeping dread, chalking it up to first night jitters. But sleep felt impossible. Unable to rest, I began to explore the cabin more closely. In a drawer near the bed, I found something that made my skin prickle, a small, tarnished locket, its surface engraved with faded initials I couldn't make out. It looked old, the kind of thing someone would cherish and keep close. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, I pocketed it, hoping to examine it in better light. Just as I turned to leave the room, my gaze fell upon a corner of the floor where a piece of paper was wedged between the wall and the floorboard. I picked it up, finding it to be a torn fragment from a journal. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled in haste, and the words sent a chill down my spine. They come at night. No one believes me, but they're watching. I'm not safe here. The silence that had once seemed merely eerie now felt ominous. Whoever had written those words had been here before me, had seen something. And now, holding that fragment, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever haunted this place had just set its sights on me. The cabin settled into darkness around me, the single dim lamp casting jagged shadows against the walls. I lay stiffly on the narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin as though it could protect me from the unsettling stillness outside. The forest felt closer at night, pressing on the walls like it was trying to squeeze me out. I tried to close my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but every sound seemed magnified in the quiet. First, it was the soft crackle of branches underfoot, as though some creature were creeping through the woods. I told myself it was nothing, just a fox or maybe a deer. But then the snapping noises grew louder, irregular, like someone or something moving in fits and starts. Every hair on my body stood on end. A chill settled over me, the kind that prickles at the edge of reason. It felt as if the night itself was watching, breathing softly against the walls. I took a slow breath, pressing my hand against the bed, grounding myself. Just nerves, I thought. It's just my mind playing tricks. And then I heard it. A whisper, soft, barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, only the cadence, the quiet murmur that seemed to slide through the cracks in the cabin walls. I held my breath, straining to hear. But as quickly as it had begun, it stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. For a moment, I lay paralyzed, gripping the blanket like a lifeline. But the seconds ticked by with no further sounds, and I forced myself to relax. This is just part of being out here alone, I told myself. Sounds seem bigger, your imagination takes over. Nothing to worry about. I settled back down, the bed creaking under my weight, trying to keep my breathing steady. But no sooner had I closed my eyes than a new noise reached me, a soft, scratching sound like nails dragging along the wooden walls of the cabin. I froze, my pulse quickening, every instinct telling me to stay still. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate, as though something were testing the walls, searching for a way in. Each scrape sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me, my heart hammering in my chest. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay put. If I kept quiet, maybe it would go away. Just an animal, I tried to reason. But that comforting thought evaporated when I heard the sound change, no longer scratching, but footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps that circled the cabin, coming to a stop just outside the window near my bed. I couldn't bring myself to look. Instead, I stared at the opposite wall, feeling my pulse in my throat, waiting. The silence grew, stretching and coiling like a snake ready to strike. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I saw it, a shadow passing across the window, moving slow and deliberate. A figure, tall and thin, almost too tall, with limbs that seemed stretched beyond reason. Its outline was blurred in the darkness, and its face was just a void, unidentifiable yet somehow watching. I bolted upright, my instincts screaming at me to act, to move, to do anything other than stay frozen. The shadow lingered for a heartbeat longer, seeming to study me through the thin glass. And then it was gone, melting back into the night as silently as it had come. I felt the walls closing in, the air thick and suffocating. Before I knew it, I was out of bed, grabbing the flashlight I'd left on the table and making my way to the door. My hand shook as I fumbled with the lock, throwing it open and stepping out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the darkness. The flashlight beam sliced through the night, casting sharp shadows among the trees. I swept it back and forth, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of the wind. The figure, if it had ever been there, was gone. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the isolation was already getting to me, playing tricks on my mind. But then, as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the small porch table, next to my bag, lay my wallet, open. I'd left it zipped away in my backpack when I unpacked, a detail I was certain of. I stared at it, the fear now solid, filling me with a sickening certainty. Whoever, or whatever, I'd seen outside had come far closer than I'd realized. It had been inside. As I closed the door, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down once more. The sense of isolation, once unsettling, now felt suffocating. Whoever had been here before had left in a hurry, left behind warnings I hadn't understood, left behind that locket. Now I understood why. I locked the door, my hands shaking. The stillness of the night had returned, wrapping around the cabin once more, but now it felt like a shroud. I sank back onto the bed, glancing toward the window, expecting to see that tall, thin shadow reappear at any moment. And just as I was beginning to convince myself it was over, I heard a faint sound, a whisper, soft and close, sliding through the cracks of the cabin walls. The words were too quiet to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, as if it knew I was alone, helpless, far from anyone who could hear me scream. I lay there, paralyzed, feeling the terror settle deep within me. When morning finally arrived, it brought little comfort. The memories of the shadow outside, of the quiet, persistent scratching on the walls, clung to me as the dim light of dawn seeped through the trees. But I had to shake off the fear, had to remind myself that daylight would reveal the answers that eluded me in the dark. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my flashlight, pocket knife, and phone, which still had no service, and stepped out into the cool, heavy air of the forest. The landscape was a labyrinth of twisted trunks and tangled underbrush, as if nature had tried to fortify the forest against intruders like me. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like bony fingers, casting shadows that shifted with the slight breeze. It was quiet, unnervingly so. I could hear my own footsteps echoing as I moved, each crunch of leaves and snap of twigs breaking the fragile silence. The only other sound was my own breathing, shallow and unsteady, as if even my body could sense the wrongness in the air. I kept my eyes sharp, watching for any signs of wildlife, but the forest felt deserted, a place abandoned by the natural world. Still, I walked deeper, trying to convince myself that the isolation was just my imagination, a byproduct of last night's terror. But then I saw something that made my blood chill. On the bark of a thick, ancient tree ahead of me, a strange symbol had been carved, deeply etched into the wood. It looked almost like an eye, surrounded by smaller lines and dots, giving the impression that it was watching. My pulse quickened, my eyes darting around as if expecting someone, or something, to step out from behind the trees and explain the markings. As I moved forward, more symbols appeared on the trunks around me. They grew increasingly elaborate, some resembling animals or twisted human forms, others spiraling in shapes that felt ancient and alien. I traced my fingers over one of the carvings, feeling the deep grooves where the bark had been gouged away, each stroke deliberate and precise. This wasn't the work of someone idly carving initials into a tree. This was something ritualistic, purposeful. And it left a gnawing sense of dread in my stomach, a whisper of a warning that perhaps I shouldn't be here. The further I went, the stranger my discoveries became. Near one of the carved trees, I found a small trinket lying in the dirt, a crude doll made from twigs and bits of cloth, bound together with twine. The face had been painted in red, just 2 dots and a line that made the expression look both simple and disturbingly malicious. I felt a shiver as I picked it up, wondering who would leave such a thing in the middle of the forest and why. A few feet away, a small pile of animal bones had been arranged in a circle, bleached white and brittle, each bone placed with care. As I studied it, I saw something else, an old, faded photograph resting on a nearby rock. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a small child standing together in front of a cabin, their faces frozen in awkward smiles. The photo looked weathered, edges curled and faintly stained, as though it had been left here for years, exposed to the elements. But something about the setting in the background seemed hauntingly familiar. It looked just like the cabin I was staying in. A chill ran down my spine as I tucked the photo into my pocket, unable to shake the feeling that I was retracing someone else's steps, following a trail they'd left behind. And yet, as I continued, more of these artifacts appeared, each one stranger and more disturbing than the last. Small bones strung together to form chains hanging from tree branches, swaying gently in the breeze as though signaling to something unseen. Other photos, old and decaying, depicting more strangers, some blurry, their faces obscured, their expressions unreadable. A broken locket, its hinges rusted shut, lying half buried near a tree. Each item seemed placed deliberately, leading me further into the woods, like a trail of breadcrumbs laid by some twisted hand. A sense of unease settled in my gut, heavy and relentless. I felt like I was being drawn deeper, led by something unseen and malevolent, a presence that stayed just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. It was a silent force, invisible but palpable, guiding me further from the cabin, further from safety. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I broke through the thick underbrush and found myself standing in a small clearing. The ground was bare and scorched in places, the remnants of several campfires scattered around. Blackened rocks and charred wood lay in haphazard piles, the ashes long since cold. Bits of clothing, torn and dirty, lay half buried in the dirt, as though abandoned in haste. An old, frayed sneaker lay near one of the fire pits, its laces knotted and worn, its owner nowhere to be found. A sense of dread settled over me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Whoever had been here before me had left in a hurry, or maybe they hadn't left at all. I turned in a slow circle, taking in the eerie silence, the emptiness. Yet, as I stared into the shadows beyond the clearing, I felt certain that I wasn't alone. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But some dark curiosity held me rooted to the spot, a sick need to know what lay beyond, what answers the forest was hiding. I took a tentative step forward, feeling the crunch of dead leaves beneath my feet, the whisper of the wind brushing past me. And then, I heard it. A voice, a faint whisper drifting through the trees, too soft to make out the words. It felt as if it were calling to me, urging me forward. I strained to hear, but it faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves. I looked around, my skin prickling with the sensation of being watched, my heart pounding against my ribs. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a flicker of shadow darting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. My breath hitched, my muscles tensing as I turned to look, but whatever it was had already vanished, slipping back into the darkness as silently as it had come. A sickening sense of dread washed over me as I backed away, my instincts screaming that I'd seen enough, that I needed to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, something else caught my eye, a tree at the far edge of the clearing, its bark marked with symbols far more intricate and sinister than the ones I'd seen before. They twisted and coiled around each other, forming patterns that made my head spin, as though they held some dark, incomprehensible meaning. I stared at the symbols, transfixed, a strange compulsion pulling me closer. But the longer I looked, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening, the air growing thick and oppressive. It was as though the very woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting for me to make a move. At last, the spell broke, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I tore my gaze away from the tree. I didn't know what force had brought me here, what had left those symbols, those trinkets, that strange collection of relics. But I knew one thing with a certainty that chilled me to the bone: I wasn't welcome here. Dusk settled over the forest with an unsettling finality, shadows stretching long and dark across the clearing as I sat inside the cabin, trying to shake off the events of the day. My hands were restless, clenching and unclenching as I watched the last of the daylight slip behind the horizon. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the symbols on the trees, the eerie clearing, and those scattered trinkets had no real meaning. But each time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the crude dolls, the weathered photos, the animal bones arranged as if for some ancient ritual. I tried to take a deep breath, to steady myself, but the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, reminding me that I was far from home, miles away from the nearest person. Or so I thought. With a sigh, I decided to step outside, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. But the moment I opened the door, a sense of unease hit me, sharper than before. The ground in front of the cabin looked wrong. A trail of disturbed earth stretched from the porch steps into the forest, a narrow line that wove between the trees before disappearing into the shadows. My gaze followed the path, and that's when I saw it, a tree on the edge of the clearing, its bark marred with fresh scratches. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, realizing what the carving was, my own initials, scrawled with a crude, almost violent intensity. Panic flared in my chest. I hadn't carved anything into the trees. I barely touched them, too disturbed by the symbols and trinkets scattered throughout the forest. But something had. And the marks were unmistakably fresh, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had only recently finished, knowing I would see them. My eyes darted around, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, but the woods remained eerily still, silent save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Just then, something caught my eye near the base of the tree. I moved closer, a deep sense of dread pooling in my stomach as I realized what it was, a strip of cloth, ragged and torn, smeared with something dark. Blood. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the fabric, bile rising in my throat. I took a step back, my mind racing with questions. Who had been here? And why leave this twisted, blood-stained clue? I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, a cold realization sinking in. I wasn't alone here. As I backed away from the tree, every instinct in me screamed to get back to the cabin, to lock myself inside. But just as I turned, something stopped me in my tracks. A voice, faint, guttural, whispered my name, drifting from the trees as if carried on the wind. Justin. The sound was low, almost animalistic, a sound that no human voice should be able to produce. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from all directions at once, wrapping around me, filling me with an unshakable terror. My pulse raced, my body frozen as the name repeated, slithering through the darkness, laced with a chilling familiarity. I stumbled backward, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead, weighed down by a primal fear that held me rooted to the spot. It was only when I heard the unmistakable crack of a branch behind me that my paralysis broke, adrenaline kicking in as I turned and bolted for the cabin. I practically threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the lock, my hand shaking so violently that it took several tries to secure it. Every fiber of my being was on high alert as I rushed from window to window, checking the locks, making sure each one was shut tight. I could still hear the whisper in my mind, repeating my name, drawing closer with each passing second. Outside, the sounds continued, footsteps crunching over dead leaves, the soft scrape of branches against the cabin walls, as though something was circling, prowling, waiting for me to let my guard down. My heart thudded painfully as I pressed my ear to the door, listening, barely daring to breathe. The noises were slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there knew I was listening, knew I was afraid. A low thud echoed against the wall to my left, then another. The sound seemed almost rhythmic, like a twisted heartbeat drumming against the wooden walls. I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way to escape, but every plan felt impossible. Outside, the footsteps paused, and for a few blessed moments, silence reigned. Then I heard it again, soft and insidious, a scraping sound, like claws dragging against the wood, moving from window to window, testing each one. My pulse raced, my mind spiraling as I imagined some creature lurking just outside, something twisted and unnatural, waiting for me to make a mistake. I backed away from the door, my hands clenched into fists, teeth gritted. Every instinct screamed for me to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, alone in the middle of a forest that felt more alien by the second. I'd come here thinking I could brave the wilderness, face the isolation. But now, as the cabin walls seemed to close in around me, I felt the crushing weight of a mistake I couldn't undo. As the night wore on, I huddled in the center of the room, clutching my flashlight, heart racing with every creak and groan of the cabin. I couldn't tell if the sounds were real or if my mind was beginning to play tricks on me. But one thought remained clear, gnawing at me, filling me with a bone-deep dread. I wasn't supposed to be here. And something out there knew it. The cabin was silent now, the shadows outside finally retreating as dawn began to break over the horizon. Yet even in the light, the sense of unease clung to me like a second skin. I spent the morning pacing the cramped space, reliving every moment from the previous night, the whispers, the footsteps, the clawing sounds that scraped against the walls, each noise a reminder that something out there was watching, waiting. I was trapped in a horror I couldn't explain, and the more I thought about it, the more desperate I felt. I needed answers. Anything to help me understand what was happening here. In a fit of restlessness, I began moving things around the cabin, lifting cushions, opening drawers, searching every corner for something that could give me insight into this nightmare. I pulled the rug from under the small wooden table, revealing a dusty, uneven floor underneath. My gaze fell on a spot in the floorboards that looked slightly off, a small seam, almost invisible, as if someone had hastily concealed it. Heart pounding, I pried my fingers into the gap and pulled, and with a soft creak, the floorboard lifted, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, wrapped in a layer of fabric that had long since frayed, was a small, tattered book. It was yellowed, its cover worn and cracked, and as I lifted it, a thin layer of dust rose into the air, dancing in the shafts of early morning light. I held the book reverently, almost afraid to open it, as though it contained the answers I'd been searching for but didn't truly want to know. Taking a deep breath, I turned the cover, the brittle pages crackling as they fell open, revealing a cramped, messy handwriting scrawled across the paper. The ink had faded, and some pages were smudged, as though the author's hand had trembled while writing, leaving behind faint smears of ink and disturbingly darkened stains that could have been anything. Blood, perhaps, or some other substance that left me unsettled. As I read, a chill washed over me. The author had written about this very cabin, this very forest. They described nights filled with strange noises, claw marks appearing on trees, and the sense of being watched that never seemed to let up. Every word resonated with my own experience, as though I were reading my own story, except it was written by someone who had come long before me. The entries were fractured, sometimes frantic, with entire passages scratched out and pages torn or missing. But one phrase stood out, written in hurried, uneven script: "It's watching. It's always watching." My hand shook as I read it, the words echoing in my mind, each letter burned into my brain like a warning. In one passage, the author described waking up to find symbols carved into the trees around the cabin, each mark seeming to grow closer every night. Another entry spoke of seeing a tall, thin figure in the woods, its face obscured by shadow, watching from the distance. The author hadn't been able to make out the figure's features, but sensed that it was something far from human, its gaze heavy and relentless, as though it could see through walls, through time itself. The entries became increasingly erratic, the writing scrawling into near illegibility, but some lines were underlined, bolded, or otherwise marked for emphasis. "Do not follow the voices," one line read. "Stay inside after dark. It can't cross the threshold without invitation." The warnings seemed cryptic, almost like a set of unspoken rules to survive whatever was out there. Some lines were half erased, as though the author had changed their mind, erasing their own advice in a fit of paranoia or confusion. But a handful of words appeared again and again, as though they were the key to survival. "Stay quiet. Don't provoke it. Never look directly into its eyes." The journal mentioned an unnamed entity that lurked within the forest, referred to only in vague descriptions, a being that could shift its shape, that could imitate voices, and whose gaze held a strange, hypnotic power. It could lure its victims deeper into the woods, where it would mark them, a sign that they were chosen, claimed. Once marked, escape was nearly impossible. My skin prickled as I read those lines, recalling the clawed initials on the tree outside and the whisper that had called my name in that guttural, inhuman tone. Every warning I read felt like a direct address, as though the author had left these words specifically for me, desperate to share the knowledge they'd gained before they could finish the story. The entries continued, each one more terrifying than the last, each word driving a wedge deeper into my mind, leaving me feeling raw and exposed. But then, abruptly, the journal stopped. The last entry was unfinished, trailing off mid-sentence, as though the author had been interrupted. My eyes lingered on the final words: "If you're reading this, then it's already 2." I shut the journal, my heart pounding. The cryptic advice felt like breadcrumbs left by someone who had been just as desperate, just as terrified. But there was one unmistakable message that cut through the tangled web of warnings and incomplete entries. This was no ordinary cabin, and something had taken notice of me. A sudden sense of urgency overcame me. I couldn't ignore the warnings, not if I wanted to make it out alive. But the question remained: how much did I really understand? How much of the journal was cryptic rambling, and how much was actionable advice? And how could I know if I was already beyond saving? I paced around the cabin, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd read. Outside, the light was fading, casting long shadows that reached across the forest floor like grasping fingers. The whispering dread crept back in, reminding me that the forest was more alive at night, that something was watching, waiting for the dark to fall completely. As evening settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on borrowed time. Every small noise seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the rustling of leaves, even the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I couldn't help but feel that by reading the journal, I'd broken some unspoken rule, that I had invited something inside without realizing it. Suddenly, a faint sound drifted in through the window, a whisper, soft and distant, yet somehow unmistakable. My name, again, spoken in that low, guttural tone, like a hand brushing across my spine, sending a chill through my body. Justin. My blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, drawing closer, as if the voice were right outside. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized it was trying to lure me out, coaxing me to step into the night. I forced myself to remember the journal's warnings. Stay inside after dark. Don't follow the voices. The urge to run, to confront whatever was out there, was overwhelming, but I clung to the author's words, knowing they might be my only lifeline. I moved through the cabin, checking each lock, securing every window, heart hammering as the voice called again. Justin. Each whisper seemed to come from a different place, circling the cabin, probing for a way in. I felt like a trapped animal, cornered and vulnerable, with only these thin wooden walls standing between me and whatever lurked outside. The whispering stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that was somehow worse than the sound itself. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to listen, my heart racing. Then, faintly, I heard something scrape against the door, 3 slow, deliberate scratches, as if something was testing the wood, assessing its strength. In that moment, I was certain this was no ordinary visitor. Whatever was out there, it was intelligent, patient, and it knew I was scared. I backed away from the door, my mind racing, struggling to make sense of what I'd read and what was happening now. The author of the journal had left their warnings, a fragmented map of survival tactics, but there was no guarantee they would work. And as the whispers resumed, I realized with horrifying clarity that I had no way of knowing if I'd already broken one of the rules. The journal had ended abruptly, the final entries left unfinished, as if the writer had met their fate before they could share the ultimate key to survival. I was on my own, with only fragments of advice from a stranger who might have succumbed to the very thing that now haunted me. The walls creaked under the weight of the night, and the shadows pressed closer, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. And as I huddled in the cabin's dim light, clutching the journal, I couldn't escape one final, crushing thought: I was no longer the one doing the watching. I was being watched. The night was heavy, suffocating, as if the darkness itself was pressing against the cabin. I had barely slept in days, my nerves shot, every creak and groan of the wood around me making me jump. But tonight was different. I sensed it from the moment the sun dipped behind the trees, the air seeming to thicken with a weight that made it hard to breathe. As if the very forest were waiting, gathering strength. The silence grew colder, thicker, until even the sounds of my own movements seemed muffled. And then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate drag of claws along the outside walls, moving from window to window, as if mapping out every exit, every weakness. The sound was nauseating, like nails on chalkboard, yet amplified, deeper, as though whatever was out there was enjoying every moment of its haunting presence. I backed away from the walls, trying to keep my breathing steady, but every hair on my neck was standing on end. The scratching paused, and for a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, in a sudden, violent burst, something struck the cabin wall, a loud, bone-jarring bang that made the whole structure shudder. My heart leaped, and I stumbled backward, grabbing at the small table for support. The pounding came again, even harder this time, rattling the windows in their frames, as if whatever was outside was testing the strength of the cabin itself. Fear surged through me, hot and uncontrollable. The pounding continued, each impact reverberating through the walls, shaking the thin wood that felt increasingly flimsy against the weight of what was out there. And as the banging grew louder, I could hear something else, a low, guttural growl rumbling just beyond the door, circling the building. The sound was inhuman, primal, like nothing I had ever heard. It wasn't just the growl of a wild animal, it was something darker, something that carried an unnatural edge, a twisted intelligence. I backed into the center of the room, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight, wishing for anything that could protect me. But deep down, I knew that the flimsy lock on the door and the thin glass of the windows were no match for whatever was lurking outside. Desperately, I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen remained stubbornly black. I pressed the power button over and over, my fingers frantic, but it was dead, lifeless. I swore under my breath, reaching for the wall switch to turn on the cabin lights. Nothing. No faint hum, no comforting glow, just darkness. It was as if something had drained the life from the cabin, cutting me off from any connection to the outside world. My heart pounded harder, panic rising as I realized how utterly alone I was. The only sound now was my own shallow breathing, echoing in the silence, which had returned even heavier than before. The scratching resumed, more frantic this time, followed by a series of muffled thumps as though something was climbing the cabin's walls, testing each window with a methodical precision. My hand shook as I held the flashlight close, feeling helpless, trapped, knowing there was nowhere to run. I could almost feel it now, a presence, a malevolent energy pressing in from all sides, thickening the air, seeping through the thin walls like poison. And then, in a flash of moonlight through the window, I saw it. Just a glimpse, a shadow passing by, barely visible through the dirty glass, but enough to make my heart stop. Its eyes caught the light, two glinting orbs that reflected an intelligence far beyond anything natural. They were feral, piercing, unblinking, with a cruel, ancient awareness that froze me to the spot. They were watching me, studying me, as though deciding how best to break me down. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grip as a wave of nausea washed over me. I clutched my stomach, trying to keep my balance, feeling the walls close in around me as the creature's gaze seemed to burn through the wood, seeing into the very depths of my mind. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Those eyes had rooted me to the spot, filling my mind with a flood of primal terror I couldn't escape. The creature's presence was overwhelming, a force that seemed to sink into the cabin itself, filling every crevice, pressing against the windows with a relentless intensity. I could hear it breathing now, slow, deep breaths that rattled through the walls, each exhale like a dark whisper that slipped through the cracks, brushing against my skin. It felt close enough that I could almost feel its breath, hot and damp, tainted with the scent of decay and earth. Justin. The voice, a low, drawn-out whisper, drifted through the walls, filling the cabin with a sound that was almost tangible, like a hand reaching out to me. My name, spoken in that guttural tone, with a perverse familiarity that twisted my insides. It circled me, reverberating through the room, a chant that grew louder, more insistent, as if it could reach into my mind, pushing me to the edge of madness. I stumbled backward, pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The voice was everywhere, all around me, seeping into my very thoughts, filling every crevice of the cabin with its terrible presence. The scratching turned into clawing, deep gouges that sent splinters flying from the walls. The windows rattled violently as if something massive was pushing against them, testing their limits. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the pounding on the door began again, relentless, each strike shaking the entire cabin. I could feel it in my bones, the vibrations traveling through the floor, as though the creature was trying to shake me loose, to break down my last defenses. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but I knew it was pointless. No one would hear me. I was alone, surrounded by an impenetrable darkness that seemed to pulse with life, filled with a creature that knew my name, knew my fear, and was savoring every second of my suffering. In a moment of desperate clarity, I remembered the journal, the cryptic warnings left by the previous tenant, the rules about not making eye contact, about staying quiet, about never letting the creature inside. But now, huddled in the center of the cabin as it clawed and pounded on the walls, the warnings felt like they had come too late. Whatever was outside was stronger than any rule, hungrier than any warning. It wasn't just here to scare me, it was here to claim me. The clawing grew more frenzied, scraping and digging, as if the creature was ready to rip through the wood with its bare hands. I clutched the flashlight, staring at the door, heart pounding as the growls deepened, turning into a snarl that rumbled through the cabin, vibrating through the floor and into my very bones. It sounded as though it was right there, inches away, separated only by the thinnest of barriers, and with each passing second, I knew that barrier wouldn't hold. The lights flickered, a brief flash before plunging back into darkness. But in that brief moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the cabin's windows, cracked down the middle, with small splinters of glass beginning to fall away. The realization hit me hard. It was coming in. I was losing the last bit of safety I had. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I moved toward the door, thinking of barricading it with something, anything that might slow it down. But as I reached out, the cabin fell into an unnatural silence, the scratching and clawing stopping abruptly. My hand hovered over the doorknob, frozen, as I waited, my heart hammering in my chest. The quiet was deafening, a stillness that was somehow worse than the noise had been. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it, its eyes staring through the cracked window, close enough that I could see every terrible detail. The creature was pressed against the glass, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes burning with a fierce, unholy light. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared, watching me with a hunger that felt all-consuming, as though it could devour me with its gaze alone. I couldn't tear my eyes away, trapped in its stare, feeling my mind unravel with every second that passed. It was like looking into an endless void, a darkness that had no beginning and no end, a depth that threatened to pull me in and drown me. And in that gaze, I saw something else, a cruel intelligence, a twisted, ancient knowledge that spoke of things I couldn't begin to comprehend. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, my hands gripping the edge of the table as I struggled to keep from collapsing entirely. The creature's eyes followed me, unblinking, merciless, and I could feel it boring into me, peeling away the layers of my sanity one by one. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring into that darkness, feeling my thoughts slip away, my grip on reality fading. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought surfaced, dim but insistent, a realization that I needed to leave, that I had to escape this place or it would consume me entirely. But as I tore my gaze away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late, that I had already been marked, claimed by whatever was lurking in those woods. And as I stumbled to my feet, trembling, I knew with a sickening certainty that I was no longer safe, that I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake in coming here. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a prison, and I was its prey. The morning light filtered through the trees as I drove out of the forest, each mile feeling like a desperate retreat from the oppressive darkness that had gripped me. The road wound through the hills, the dense canopy giving way to open fields, a stark contrast to the suffocating isolation I had felt just hours before. But even as the landscape changed, the unease that clung to me refused to dissipate. My mind swirled with the events of the previous night, each memory sharp and vivid, fueling my determination to seek answers. As I pulled into the nearest town, an unremarkable place called Pine Hollow, I was greeted by an unsettling quiet. The streets were lined with quaint, withered buildings, their paint peeling and their signs faded, as if the entire town had been stuck in a time warp. I parked my truck in front of a small diner that looked like it had seen better days and stepped inside, the doorbell jingling softly above me. The diner was mostly empty, with only a few patrons scattered at the counter. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and grease, and the low hum of conversation stuttered to a halt as I entered. Eyes turned toward me, suspicious and wary. I approached the counter, where an elderly waitress with tired eyes and a weary smile wiped down the surface. "Morning, Hon," she said, her voice warm but laced with caution. "What can I get for you?" "Just coffee for now, please," I replied, trying to sound casual. "And, do you know anything about the forest nearby? I've been having some strange experiences out there." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "Strange experiences, huh? You're not the first to say that." She poured a cup of coffee, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "But I wouldn't go digging too deep if I were you. Best to leave those woods alone." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Why? What's going on in there?" She glanced around, lowering her voice. "Old legends, you know. Things people don't talk about anymore. It's best not to stir up the past." I pressed her for more, but she simply shook her head. "Just take my advice, sugar. Stay away from that forest. You don't know what you're messing with." Unsatisfied, I looked around the diner, spotting a couple of older men sitting in a corner booth, their heads bowed together in quiet conversation. Mustering my courage, I approached them, hoping for some answers. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I'm trying to learn more about the forest nearby. I've had some unsettling experiences, and I was hoping you could help." They exchanged glances, the atmosphere growing tense. "What do you want to know?" one of them asked, his voice gruff, as if he were wary of my intentions. "Anything you can tell me," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Legends, stories, whatever you know." The men hesitated, and finally, the older of the two spoke. "You really shouldn't be out there. It's cursed, that place. They used to perform rituals in those woods. Dark ones." "Rituals?" I echoed, intrigued but alarmed. "What kind of rituals?" The man shifted in his seat, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Ancient ones. They say they called upon things not meant to be disturbed. Creatures that can change shape, that stalk those who wander alone. Many who enter never come back." My pulse quickened at his words, a wave of dread washing over me. "Have you seen one of these creatures?" He looked me dead in the eye, his gaze steely and filled with an unsettling wisdom. "I've heard tales. Things lurking in the shadows. You might see symbols carved into trees, markings that tell you you're not welcome. If you see those signs, turn back. Whatever you do, don't let it see you." A chill crept down my spine as he spoke, every word heavy with meaning. "And if it does? Then you'd best hope you're faster than it is," he replied, leaning back in his seat as if he'd shared all he was willing to. With more questions than answers, I thanked them and returned to the counter, where the waitress handed me my coffee. "You found what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know yet, I admitted, staring into the dark liquid, my thoughts racing. But I have a feeling I'm going to need it. She nodded knowingly, her eyes filled with an unspoken concern. Just be careful, dear. Those woods aren't just trees and shadows. They hold secrets, ones that aren't meant to be uncovered. With that, I paid for my coffee and stepped back into the crisp morning air, the weight of their warnings pressing down on me. I glanced back at the diner, its windows reflecting the pale sun, and felt the chill of the forest shadow looming over me. I returned to my truck, the engine roaring to life as I headed back toward the forest. The road twisted and turned, and as I drove deeper into the wilderness, a sense of dread settled in my stomach. The trees closed in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Once I reached the cabin, I parked and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. The morning light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that danced ominously across the ground. I stepped out, my heart pounding as I approached the cabin. Inside, the air felt different, charged with a heavy tension, as if the walls themselves were listening. The remnants of my previous experiences hung in the air, mingling with the scent of damp wood and decay. I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the door, hesitating as I reached for the handle. The townspeople's words echoed in my mind, warnings about the cursed forest, the shape-shifting creature. But I couldn't turn back now. Something compelled me to stay, to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. I stepped outside, scanning the ground for any signs, any symbols that might guide my way. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trees loomed larger, their gnarled branches casting ominous shadows that shifted and flickered with each step I took. Every rustle of leaves felt amplified, each snap of a twig echoing in my ears, heightening my anxiety. The further I went, the more I noticed the strange symbols carved into the bark, each one more elaborate and unsettling than the last. They seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, a language I couldn't decipher but felt instinctively warned against. My heart raced as I pressed on, feeling a malevolent presence creeping ever closer. The memories of the townspeople's warnings lingered in my mind, mingling with the fear that had become all too familiar. I had ventured into a world steeped in darkness, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could survive within it. But I couldn't turn back now. I had to confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. As I pushed deeper into the forest, I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, each step echoing with the whispers of those who had come before. And with each passing moment, I sensed the shadows gathering, ready to unveil the secrets that had long remained hidden. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows that danced across the cabin's weathered floorboards. My heart raced as I paced through the familiar rooms, the gnawing sense of dread from the town's warnings clinging to me like a damp fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I had missed, some clue that might explain the events of the past few days. Determined to uncover the truth, I began searching every corner of the cabin. The musty smell of old wood and forgotten memories filled my nostrils as I rifled through dusty drawers and scoured the shelves. I felt like an intruder in someone else's life, but the urge to find answers outweighed my hesitation. In the back room, a space I hadn't fully explored before, I noticed the light barely penetrated the dark corners. As I pushed open the door, a chill swept over me. The air felt heavier, thick with a palpable sense of foreboding. I switched on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom, revealing the walls adorned with strange markings. At first, I thought they were mere scratches, but as I stepped closer, I recognized them as intricate symbols, expertly carved into the wood. My pulse quickened as I traced their forms with my fingers. They resembled the signs I had seen in the forest, only more elaborate and layered with meaning. My mind raced with possibilities. What had happened here? Who had done this? In the corner of the room, my light fell upon a series of artifacts that sent a jolt of unease through me. A collection of crude totems, each one more grotesque than the last, stood in a haphazard arrangement. They seemed to watch me, their carved faces twisted in expressions of agony or ecstasy, depending on the angle from which I viewed them. I felt a wave of revulsion wash over me, mixed with an undeniable curiosity. A low rumble of thunder echoed outside, and I instinctively glanced out the window, the sky darkening as clouds began to gather. It felt as if nature itself was responding to the energy in the room, reflecting the growing storm within me. On the table, an old, crumpled map caught my attention. My heart raced as I unfolded it, revealing detailed markings of the forest. My eyes widened as I recognized the symbols, ones I had seen etched into the trees. They marked specific locations, likely tied to the rituals mentioned by the townspeople. Each mark felt like a beacon of warning, illuminating paths that I had unknowingly traversed. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. The creature I had encountered was no random predator of the woods. It was tied to these ancient practices, bound to the land by dark rituals long forgotten. I felt sick to my stomach as I pieced together the connection. My very presence here, my intrusion into this cursed land, may have awakened something that had lain dormant for generations. Panic surged within me, clawing at my throat. What if I had triggered a force that could not easily be stopped? What if the creature was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike? My breath quickened as I stepped back, the realization that I was entangled in something far greater and darker than I had ever imagined. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, whispering secrets of an ancient past, warning me that I had crossed a threshold. I had become part of a narrative that had been written long before my arrival, a tale of sacrifice and darkness that demanded a price. As thunder cracked outside, sending a shiver down my spine, I knew I had to act quickly. I couldn't afford to remain ignorant of the dangers lurking just beyond the cabin's walls. The feeling of being watched intensified, a suffocating awareness that I was no longer alone in this place. Every shadow felt alive, every creak of the cabin a reminder of the weight of the secrets it held. With renewed urgency, I gathered the map and the totems, determined to find answers before the storm consumed me entirely. I had to uncover the truth behind the rituals and the creature that hunted in the night. The forest was a labyrinth of mysteries, and I was trapped at its center, teetering on the edge of something horrific and profound. As I stepped back into the main room, the air thickened with tension, a silence that felt charged with impending doom. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had unleashed was watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to reclaim its territory. The thought of returning to the forest filled me with dread, but I had no choice. I needed to confront whatever darkness awaited me, to unravel the threads of this sinister tapestry before it ensnared me completely. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but I was determined to face it head-on, even as the shadows lengthened around me, whispering of things that were best left undisturbed. The night was a tapestry of darkness, the trees rising like ancient sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. A bone-chilling wind whispered through the forest, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Armed with nothing more than a rusted knife, the map I had discovered, and an overwhelming sense of dread, I stepped into the shadows, determined to face whatever haunted me. The cabin receded behind me, swallowed by the gloom as I plunged deeper into the heart of the forest. The moon hung high above, a sliver of silver light casting eerie shapes upon the ground. Each step felt heavier, laden with the weight of the ancient secrets that clung to the air like mist. The symbols carved into the trees seemed to pulse with life, guiding me deeper into the labyrinth of wood and darkness. As I walked, the sounds of the forest grew louder, a cacophony of whispers and rustles that filled the silence. I could feel something lurking just beyond the reach of my vision, a presence that sent shivers down my spine. My heart raced, a primal instinct warning me that I was not alone. Suddenly, a rustling in the underbrush jolted me from my thoughts. I spun around, clutching the knife tightly. The shadows shifted, and I caught a glimpse of movement, something long and sinuous darting between the trees. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I raced deeper into the forest. The creature was pursuing me, its form shifting and blending with the darkness. I could hear it behind me, a low growl that rumbled like thunder, echoing through the trees. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the world around me as I fought to keep my footing on the uneven ground. Every time I glanced back, I saw nothing but shadows, yet the feeling of being watched intensified, each rustle in the leaves a reminder that it was closing in. The forest twisted and turned, a maze of uncertainty that disoriented me, warping my sense of direction. I stumbled, the underbrush grabbing at my legs, but I forced myself to keep moving. My thoughts raced, caught in a frenzy of hallucinations and reality. Faces appeared in the shadows, twisted, anguished expressions that flickered and vanished as quickly as they came. Were these echoes of the past, remnants of those who had come before me? Or was it the creature, playing tricks on my mind? I pressed forward, fighting against the grip of fear that threatened to consume me. The map burned in my pocket, a lifeline I desperately clung to, though I had no idea where it might lead me. All I knew was that I had to escape, had to confront this malevolence that stalked me through the dark. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me dropped away, and I stumbled into a clearing, a wide, open space littered with remnants of past rituals. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy, and as I took in my surroundings, I felt the creature draw closer, its presence suffocating. I turned, ready to make a run for it, but then I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. Emerging from the shadows was the creature, its form shifting and coalescing before me. It was a grotesque amalgamation of features, a nightmarish blend of familiar shapes that twisted and morphed with every heartbeat. Its eyes glowed like embers, reflecting a feral intelligence that sent terror coursing through me. "Face your truth," it seemed to whisper, though its mouth never moved. The voice echoed in my mind, resonating with something deep within me, a haunting familiarity that sent chills down my spine. I stood my ground, heart racing as the creature circled me, its movements fluid and unnatural. I felt trapped, cornered not just by the beast, but by the weight of my own fears and doubts. The symbols around me seemed to pulse, revealing a deeper truth. This entity was bound to the forest, to the very rituals I had uncovered, but it was also bound to me. The realization struck me like a thunderclap. I was part of this nightmare. The forest had recognized me as an intruder, but it also reflected my own inner darkness, my regrets and fears given form. The truth of the entity was entwined with my own, an unholy bond forged through the act of trespass. "Why are you here?" it growled, the voice echoing in the stillness, reverberating through the clearing. "What do you seek?" "I just want to escape," I gasped, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "Escape is a choice, yet here you stand, drawn by the call of the woods." "You cannot run from yourself," it hissed, its form shifting again, revealing glimpses of my own face distorted within its monstrous visage. I stumbled backward, horrified by the reflection of my own fear. Memories flashed before me, regrets, failures, moments of weakness, each one twisting into a grotesque mockery, merging with the creature's form. I realized then that I had to confront these demons if I ever hoped to escape. "Then tell me what I must do," I cried, desperation coursing through me. "How do I break this bond?" The creature paused, its monstrous features softening, revealing the truth beneath the terror. Embrace the darkness within. Only then can you understand what you seek. Accept your past, and the chains that bind you will shatter. With those words, the world around me began to shift, the clearing fading into a kaleidoscope of memories and shadows. I felt myself being pulled into the depths of my own mind, a whirlwind of thoughts and fears threatening to engulf me. I saw faces of people I had lost, the weight of every decision that had led me to this moment crashing over me like a tidal wave. I fell to my knees, the weight of my past pressing down, but as I faced it, I felt a flicker of strength within me. I had spent too long running from my fears, from the pain that had shaped me. I had to confront the truth, not just about the forest and the entity, but about myself. As the shadows encircled me, I raised my head, defiance igniting within my chest. I am not afraid, I declared, my voice steady. I accept my past. I embrace the darkness. In that moment, the creature recoiled, the shifting form flickering as if caught in a battle between light and dark. The air around me crackled with energy, the oppressive weight lifting as I found my footing. The forest shuddered, and the symbols carved into the trees began to glow, resonating with a power I could feel surging through me. With newfound resolve, I stood tall, facing the creature head-on. I will not be your prey. I will find my way out of this nightmare. The creature let out a roar that shook the ground beneath me, a sound filled with rage and anguish, but it was not enough to drown out my determination. The forest itself seemed to shift, the trees parting as a path emerged before me, a path leading back to the cabin, to safety. I took a step forward, ready to escape the terror that had consumed me. But as I looked back at the creature, I saw it begin to dissolve into shadows, the very essence of fear dissipating as I reclaimed my power. Know this, it whispered, its voice echoing like a fading memory. You may escape, but the darkness within will always linger. Do not forget. With those words hanging in the air, I turned and ran, the path opening before me as I sprinted through the forest, my heart pounding with each step. I could feel the shadows retreating, the haunting presence dissipating as I broke free from the bonds of fear. I ran faster, fueled by the understanding that I had faced my demons, that I had confronted the darkness within and emerged stronger. As I burst through the tree line, the cabin loomed ahead, a beacon of safety against the night. I raced inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the forest's secrets lingered in the air, but I knew I had overcome something profound. The darkness may always linger, but I had faced it, and I would continue to fight against it. As I locked the door and sank to the floor, the shadows that had haunted me began to fade, replaced by a flicker of hope. I was alive, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace amidst the chaos. I would not let the forest claim me. I would forge my own path. The forest loomed around me, a dark abyss filled with whispered secrets and shadows that felt alive. Each footfall was a battle against the weight of exhaustion threatening to drag me down. I pushed myself harder, the urgency of my escape driving me forward as I weaved through the dense underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes and skin. My heart raced, pumping adrenaline through my veins, igniting a primal instinct to survive. With each step, the oppressive darkness of the forest pressed in, and I could still feel the echoes of the creature's presence lurking just beyond the fringes of my vision. I dared not look back, fearing what I might see, what might be gaining on me. The memory of its grotesque form, a swirling mass of fear and shadows, haunted me, a specter chasing me through the night. Every instinct screamed for me to keep running, to escape the malevolence that had tried to ensnare me in its grasp. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I forced myself onward, each stride fueled by desperation. I was so close to the cabin, I could almost see it in my mind's eye, a sanctuary against the dark. Yet, the deeper I ran, the more I felt the forest shift around me, the trees twisting into unnatural shapes as if they were conspiring to keep me from my escape. The path blurred, disorienting me, and I stumbled, falling hard against the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, but I grit my teeth, refusing to give in to despair. I pushed myself back up, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. As I trudged on, a sudden stillness enveloped the woods, an unnatural silence that sent a jolt of fear through me. It was as if the very air had thickened, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The shadows grew darker, swallowing any trace of moonlight, and I began to doubt my senses, questioning whether I was still in the forest I had known. I pressed forward, driven by sheer willpower, each breath feeling heavier as if the darkness itself were trying to pull me down. But with every step, the exhaustion gnawed at me, whispering sweet promises of surrender. I could almost feel its fingers brushing against my skin, coaxing me to stop, to rest. It would be so easy. No. I shook my head, forcing my weary body onward. I couldn't succumb. I wouldn't allow the forest to claim me. I had faced the creature, faced my fears, and yet the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever, clawing at the edges of my resolve. Then, through the thickening darkness, I spotted a glimmer of light ahead. Hope ignited within me as I recognized it as the cabin, a beacon in the suffocating night. I pushed myself harder, fueled by the vision of safety. But just as I was about to break through the last line of trees, a voice echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that the forest was not ready to let me go. "You cannot escape," it whispered, reverberating through the silence. "You belong to us now." My heart sank, and I faltered. What if the stories were true? What if I was caught in a cycle, bound to this cursed place, destined to wander these woods forever like the souls that had come before me? Panic surged as I stumbled, feeling the ground shift beneath me. I reached the edge of the clearing, and as I stepped into the light, my breath caught in my throat. The cabin stood before me, but the light flickered and faded, replaced by a scene that sent chills through my core. The familiar structure had twisted into something sinister, warped and weather-beaten, shadows pooling at its base like dark liquid. I hesitated, doubt crashing over me like a wave. Was this the reality I had fought so hard to reach, or merely another illusion conjured by the forest? The door creaked open slowly, an invitation, or a trap. My instincts screamed for me to turn back, to flee from the encroaching darkness, but my body felt rooted to the spot, a haunting sense of inevitability washing over me. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, the woods erupted into chaos. The trees groaned, branches snapping, and the shadows pulsed with life. I turned to run, but the path behind me morphed, branches tangling together, closing off my escape. My heart raced, a wild drumbeat echoing in the night as I felt the forest shifting, reshaping around me like a living entity intent on keeping its secrets. With every fiber of my being, I pushed forward, determined to escape the horrors that lurked behind me. I broke through the trees and into the clearing, but it felt like I was moving through thick molasses, each step harder than the last. As I approached the cabin, I could see the ground beneath me shifting, roots emerging from the soil, creeping toward me like fingers grasping for my ankles. I leapt back, but the air felt charged with a malevolence that sent terror coursing through my veins. The light flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced around me, distorting my perception. And then I saw it, the creature, its form shifting in the darkness, coiling around the edges of my vision. It was watching me, waiting for me to falter, to succumb to the fear that threatened to envelop me. I was trapped, ensnared in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Just as I thought I was lost, a final surge of adrenaline coursed through me. I had to fight. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left and charged toward the cabin, determined to reclaim my escape. But as I reached for the door, it swung open with a haunting creak, revealing a darkness that seemed to pulse like a living heartbeat. I stepped inside, ready to confront whatever awaited me, but the interior was not as I remembered. The familiar walls were warped, twisted by the shadows that crawled along the surfaces. It felt like stepping into a mouth, an abyss ready to swallow me whole. Then, the door slammed shut behind me, sealing my fate. The air thickened, and I turned, facing the creature in its full, monstrous form. It was no longer just a shadow, it was a nightmare made flesh, a reflection of the darkness I had fought to escape. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by the fear that threatened to consume me. The creature advanced, its eyes gleaming with a feral hunger, and I realized with chilling clarity that I had become part of the forest's mystery, a tale woven into the fabric of darkness, destined to haunt the shadows forever. In my final moments, I understood the forest's dark secret. It thrived on fear, feeding off the souls of the unfortunate who stumbled into its depths. I was now among them, lost to the cycle of terror and despair. As the shadows closed in, my scream echoed into the night, swallowed by the trees, and the darkness enveloped me, leaving nothing but silence in my wake. The forest stood still, waiting patiently for the next unfortunate soul to wander into its grasp, a hungry predator in a world where time itself held no meaning. And so, the cycle continued, the darkness ever watchful, ever hungry, awaiting its next victim, forever a part of the forest's chilling legacy.